My name is Jackie Malton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real-life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning, Pete. My name's Jackie Malton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK and the USA. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. Today, I'm reinvestigating one of the most horrific series of murders in British criminal history. 2 mothers and a child would lose their lives in the most brutal fashion imaginable. An innocent man would be imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. And every officer involved in the hunt for this murderer would bear the scars of bringing him to justice. His name, Robert Napper. I am aware of the details of the huge violence committed against these women. So therefore, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to speaking to officers who may have been affected at the time by the actual carnage that they were faced when they turned up to these murder deposition sites and the impact that it had on them at the time, and separating their professionalism from emotions, and the fact that they would have had daughters of a similar age, and the fact that young children were involved. Where young children are murdered, it always reaches the hearts of everybody, but when you're a detective, especially so as well, and the impact that it has had on their lives would be quite telling. This is the case of Robert Napper, who was responsible for the murder of 2 women and 1 of their daughters. I'm heading to Plumstead in southeast London, where in 1992, the police were called to the scene of a murder. I've managed to track down one of the first detectives on the scene, Detective Sergeant Alan Jackman. Hi, Alan, it's Jackie Malton, ex-Scotland Yard detective. I'm looking through the old files for the Samantha Bissett case. I understand you worked on that case as a detective. Would you be free to talk to me sometime?
Hello, Jackie. It's Alan Jackman here. Yes, I remember the case very well indeed. It was a particularly chilling one. I'm only too pleased to come over and talk about it. Bye for now. Cheers.
Alan has agreed to meet me at the scene of the crime where some 25 years ago, a young mother named Samantha Bissett lived with her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. What kind of area was this, Alan, in 1993? Has it changed much?
It is exactly as it was on the day of the murder, with this green area at the back of the flat, surrounded, as you see, by woodland. And anybody could walk along there and look directly into the flat.
And the balcony is kind of quite easily accessible.
It's easy to climb in there. It's only about 3 feet off the ground to get onto the bottom sill, and anybody of any reasonable standard of fitness can climb over into the balcony, which is recessed into the wall, giving access to the French windows.
The property's open aspect meant that anyone walking along the common could look into it. And it soon caught the attention of a man with a previous conviction for stalking. His name was Robert Napper. On the day of the murder, Napper must have lain in wait for the right moment to enter the family home. And when you saw the scene, what was your instinct?
I was shocked. I was, yeah, really shocked.
Once inside, he took Samantha unawares and murdered her in a frenzy. That saw her stabbed more than 60 times and ended with her being disemboweled. As she lay dead on the living room floor, Napper turned his attention to 4-year-old Jasmine. Can you paint a picture, Alan, of the scene inside of this flat without going into too much detail?
There was a large pooling of what was obviously blood next to the front door. And then we went into the front room where we saw Samantha displayed on the living room floor.
And I understand the scene really distressed the police photographer who became ill at the scene and had to leave. Yes,
the designated scenes of crime photographer was already at the scene, going round. She was an experienced photographer, but she found it so distressing that she did in fact collapse at the scene, and we called an ambulance to have her taken away. I've been involved in hundreds of murder investigations, but in this particular one, my stride was broken. I had young children myself at the time, which also accentuates that feeling. And having been appointed family liaison, I was in touch with the family. I had to show them the bodies in the mortuary, and it was quite humbling, really, to see how people can cope with such appalling events.
Speaking to, the lovely Alan Jackerman detective, I know how this case has impacted him for years of his life. The crime scene at Samantha Bissett's house was like a post-mortem. It was like a post-mortem for what Robert Napper did to her. There was blood and body parts, all over the place, and this total massacre of this young woman in her own house. From what I can gather, it just took their breath away, and they really had to process that before they could kind of get on, with the job of investigating what had happened to her. Alan has put me in touch with Roger Boydell-Smith, the detective who was tasked with the extremely important job of gathering evidence amongst the awfulness of that crime scene. Hi, Roger. My name's Jackie Malton. I've been looking back at the details of the Robert Napper case, and it's my understanding you were the exhibits officer. I'm really intrigued to find out what happened in this case.
Hi, Jackie. I did work for the Metropolitan Police on the Robert Napper case. I can tell you about the chilling tale. Let's meet. Cheers, thank you.
It was a scene of abject horror. Nothing I'd ever seen in my 30 years of service, police service. It's something that's been etched on my memory ever since. When we went into the hallway, there was a thick layer of blood on the carpet, and further into the hallway, you could see that the body of Samantha had been dragged into the living room. Her body had been placed in a star shape. She'd been severely mutilated. The perpetrator had stabbed her numerous times, obviously in a frenzy, along her face, her upper torso, her chest. An attempt had been made by the perpetrator to remove her legs. The body of Samantha's daughter, Jasmine, who was only 4 years old at the time, and it was subsequently confirmed that she had been suffocated. So it was a scene of absolute horror. No other word to describe it.
Of all the exhibits that you submitted to the laboratory, which ones in your memory were the most significant that kind of went on to form part of the case?
Well, the most significant piece of evidence retrieved from the scene were the fingerprints.
In relation to the fingerprint evidence, initially it came back that the prints that you spoke about was believed to belong to Samantha Bissett.
Yes, that was another extraordinary coincidence, because we submitted, I think, in excess of 100 sets of prints from that scene. Different prints. Samantha had a lot of friends. She had a lot of visitors to the flat, most of whom were obviously friends, relatives, and neighbours. You know, quite confirmed that their presence at the scene was legitimate, and which is very rare in a complex murder investigation, that all the elimination prints, or all the prints that were taken from the scene, were eliminated.
The absence of any other key evidence, such as fingerprints or witnesses, meant the police were at a loss in the case of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. It was hoped that an autopsy might have some answers, but unhappy with the results of the first one, the police requested another, which was performed by the country's pre-eminent pathologist, Dr. Richard Shepherd. Hi, Richard. It's Jackie Malton, ex-Scotland Yard detective. You worked as a forensic pathologist on Robert Napper's victims. You're just the person I need to talk with to gain more insight into these atrocities.
Hi, Jackie. I was the forensic pathologist who examined the body of Samantha Bissett. We can meet to discuss this further.
When we first saw her, of course, she'd been reconstructed after the original examination. But when we were unpicking those suture lines, it became quite clear that there was a gap. And because I knew that taking of trophies was something that people did in circumstances, in deaths like this, I was on the lookout for that. And we could see, as we put her back together again, a little more carefully, with me observing and seeing, yes, there was a piece of abdominal skin that was missing.
That trophy then instigates in his memory the murder that he committed, and he can go back to that fantasy.
It can take it, if it's an inanimate object, of course, it can be kept for a long time. A piece of skin has, even with preservation, keeping it in the fridge or freezer or wherever, it has a limited lifespan, but it is the portal. It's the thing that allows the murderer to go back to the scene, to rekindle the excitement, the emotions, and the experience for them.
But it wasn't the murder of Samantha Bissett that was making headlines. A year earlier, a young woman named Rachel Nickell had been taking her child for a walk on Wimbledon Common when she had been attacked and viciously killed. But in this case, the police had already arrested a man called Colin Stagg.
I was the original pathologist with Rachel, so I did the original counts. I saw Rachel's body at the scene on Wimbledon Common.
And when you did the post-mortem on Samantha Bissett, did you connect the two?
Well, funnily enough, yes, I did. And as I was looking at Samantha at the scene and in the post-mortem, I remember saying something like, well, it's lucky we have Colin Stagg caught for Rachel, because otherwise I would say this is exactly where I would expect this serial killer to progress to. He's gone from outside, starting to play games with the body, starting to injure, damage and explore the body, which was his niche. Now he's come inside, where he's not going to be disturbed, and he's able to do it. Links, young child and mother, that, it was all there. I mean, generally, the serial killer will kill similar people. We have it here with two. Rachel Nickell, young woman, attractive, blonde hair with a young child. Samantha, very similar. The link between a woman and a child. That's the theme that bounces through him. It's easy in retrospect to say it's there.
What the police didn't know was that all the evidence they needed could have been found in two separate cases which happened at opposite sides of London. One was a series of violent rapes of women, and many of them had their children with them, known as the Green Chain Rapes. The other case was the now infamous murder of Rachel Nickell. And that's what he did, Napa. You see, he targeted in the open air women who had young children. And part of that, I think, is a strategy that they would surrender, I think, because their first thought was to protect their own child. But the Samantha Bissett case, and indeed the string of other crimes, were to reach a turning point when legendary Detective Superintendent Mickey Banks decided to shake things up. Hi, Mickey. I remember you from my own days in the Met with great affection. I'm intrigued to find out what made you demand that the fingerprints from the Samantha Bissett murder scene be rechecked.
Yeah, hi, Jackie. Yes, I was the detective superintendent in charge of the horrendous double murder of Samantha Bissett and a 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. I am willing to discuss the details further with you.
Well, the reason was a couple of months later into the inquiry when I and my boss decided to reinvestigate some of the rapes to see if the rapist could be responsible for our murder, which there's always a chance.
And when the fingerprint evidence came back, contradicting the original examination, they gave you a name.
Yeah.
And who was that?
That was Robert Napper, who was subsequently convicted of Samantha's murder.
Robert Napper's fingerprints were already on record from when he'd been arrested for stalking a woman in Plumstead. At the time of his arrest, police had found pistols and knives at his flat, and he'd served 8 weeks in jail. But he was eliminated from the rape inquiries because victims described the rapist as 5'10" and Napper was 6'3". But the fingerprint match was the breakthrough the police needed to identify Napper as their man in the case of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. How did you feel then, as a SIO, being given that evidence that you'd now got a name?
Well, I wasn't very happy, and I think most people weren't very happy that this Robert Napper had been asked twice by the rape team to come in for DNA blood sample, as his name had come up a couple of times, and a couple of the rapes, a couple of people he worked with said they believed he was capable of rapes and stuff like that. If you don't come in the first time, you go back, which I think they went back the second time. He again promised to come into the police station, failed to attend. Now, when we found that, the first thing I thought was, here we go. This is a bloody good chance that this is our murderer. You know, not groping at straws, but it's like a red rag to a bull. I could never understand why he wasn't dragged in.
The police connected Napper to the Green Chain Rapes, then they may well have prevented him from becoming a murderer. Did you ever look or speak to the detectives who were doing the investigation into the murder of Rachel Nickell?
Yeah, we asked for a meeting.
Did you suggest to them that the person who'd committed the murder of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, there were kind of correlations with the murder of Rachel Nickell?
If you look at it logically, a young woman, very attractive, the way the injuries that they received looked, you know, like a slashing type thing, or somebody having a frenzied attack upon them. It looked to me very much like it was. My whole team were the same. We all thought that this could be theirs.
And what was their reaction to that?
Well, they just wouldn't entertain it at all. They'd made up their mind that Colin Stagg was guilty, and they just wouldn't see any way that it could be anybody else but Colin Stagg. If only the Green Chain Rapes had done their job properly, that Napper would have been arrested for the rapes, and they'd have been in a better position.
But how would they have found him?
Well, perhaps they wouldn't. But there was a chance if it had been done properly. As a senior officer, I would have made them go back until Napper came in, bearing in mind that they had no legal right to force him to take a DNA sample. But if he'd have refused, then that would give them more reason to look at him.
And one of the things that the officers out was the frustration that they couldn't get any publicity in the case of Samantha Bissett, who was perceived to be kind of a young hippie girl living in Plumstead. Press weren't interested in it. They were only interested in the murder of kind of Rachel Nickell. And when the team, wanted to connect Robert Napper as a prime suspect or wanted to link these two cases, they were thwarted and said, no, we've got a prime suspect. It's Colin Stagg. He's not involved in your case. I'm returning to meet Detective Alan Jackerman, who by now was at the very heart of this investigation and tasked with helping convict Napper of his many crimes.
He was researched, a photograph was taken from Plumstead, where he had a very low-level crime record, no sexual previous convictions. A photograph was brought back to Thamesmead police station and shown round the office. One of our indexers, Pam Robinson, took one look at the photograph. She had been an indexer on the Green Chain rape inquiry. She immediately said, that photograph is our Green Chain rapist. The unusual thing about those attacks were that DNA evidence had been found, and they were all linked through DNA evidence, including a rape of a young woman in her house back in 1989 off Winds Common.
In the presence of her two children. It was only once Napper was in custody that police began to realise the full extent of his criminal behaviour and how, by letting him slip the net, would continue to offend with ever-increasing degrees of violence. What was his initial response to him being arrested for murder?
Very subdued, shocked, quiet, cowed almost. But on the way to the van, he said to me, I don't know where 1A Heathfield Terrace is, I've never been there. Significant because, of course, we had the fingerprint evidence at 1A Heathfield Terrace that he had been there.
As the investigation into Napper progressed, police revisited an old case when Napper had been previously charged with possession of a firearm. Amongst the items seized from his flat at that time was a red toolbox. This contained what can only be described as a murder kit, which included a torch, a length of rope, and an A to Z in which Napper had marked significant sites.
It was obvious from that he'd marked out routes along the Green Chain Walk and also where the Jasmine and Samantha had been murdered in the flat at 1A Heathfield Terrace.
So it was you, Alan, who went over to the Rachel Nickell murder investigation, and you suggest to them that Robert Napper is a really good prime suspect. And what was their reaction to that?
Well, they took the details, and that was the last I heard from them.
How did you feel about it?
As we came away, we thought we would do further investigation ourselves.
When Alan Jackerman retired from the Metropolitan Police, he joined the Cold Case Murder Review Team, and the first thing he wanted to do was to take another look at the case of Rachel Nickell.
When I went to the review team, I found that the review was being conducted in the same office where I was working, and I went straight through to the SIO there and said that I have a good suspect for you, and gave him the details, gave him a quick report, and he put Napper's name onto a list of about another 19 suspects that he had.
And that had taken how long in years since the murder of Rachel Nickell?
That was 13 years.
13 years. Wow. 13 years. In that time, 3 lives had been lost and many more ruined. But amongst them, perhaps none more well known than the man who was wrongly accused of the murder of Rachel Nickell. He spent 13 months in jail, and even to this day, he suffers from having been associated with a murder that he did not commit. His name is Colin Stagg. Can you remind us of the day in question of the murder, which was the 15th of July, 1992? What did you do that morning?
I had a usual routine because I lived on my own, just me and my old dog. I used to walk my dog onto the common that morning from about 9 o'clock onwards, but because I had a bad migraine that morning, I didn't want to take him too far. So I went back home, took a couple of painkillers. The headache had gone a bit, so I decided to take my dog back onto the common to give him a proper walk. And there was a uniformed police officer standing at the other end in the common part. And he advised me not to go onto the common because there'd been an incident over there. And I just naturally just asked what had happened. And at that time, he said a body of a young girl had been found over there.
The following day, the headline of every newspaper was dominated by the murder of a young woman called Rachel Nickell, who had been walking her baby son on Wimbledon Common. All the police had to go on were eyewitness accounts of a man seen in the vicinity that morning. Can you tell me about the day you were arrested?
I was woken up in the early hours of the morning. I opened the door and there was a group of guys standing there. They introduced themselves as detectives, and they said they wanted to question me about the incident on Wimbledon Common on that day. They picked up on the fact that I had a few decorative knives above my fireplace. But as I've always said, you know, you go into an stately home, there's lots of knives and weapons hanging up there, and nobody suggests that there's anything wrong there, do they? You know. So
it must have been a huge shock because you're an innocent man.
Yeah.
What was the evidence that was put to you that you had been considered a prime suspect by the police?
They had 2 suspects they wanted to talk to. One was a guy with a ponytail, and the other was the guy, which we know later on became the main suspect. But facially, you know, I didn't put 2 and 2 together. You know, I didn't think it actually looked like me at all.
What other evidence did they have?
They had no evidence whatsoever, just that.
Police were convinced that Colin Stagg was the killer. And in order to get a better sense of who he was, a plan was hatched. A policewoman was sent undercover to pose as a romantic interest. How did that communication start?
I received a letter from Lizzie James saying she read about me in a newspaper at the time, and she liked to get to know me and that. And being a man living on his own, you know, that was like winning the lottery. I wrote a letter back. We started up a communication by post. But it was during those letters that she started writing to me saying that she had a dark secret she wanted to tell me. I knew that there was something not right about her, but you know, I just went along with it, basically just to be with a woman. When she finally told me that she was in a relationship with a man who's into Satanism, and apparently he sacrificed a young woman and a baby, she asked me if I'd actually did this murder because it would have turned her on, basically. And I just kept saying I didn't do it, it had nothing to do with me. And then she said she didn't want to be with anybody who couldn't have done this crime and that. So, and that's when we split up, basically.
After that last meeting with Lizzie James, what was the period of time when you were next arrested?
I think it was a couple of months afterwards.
And what happened when you were charged? Were you remanded to prison?
I was, yes. I was in prison for 13 months.
When the trial came to court, the police put forward the testimony of Lizzie James. But the judge was horrified by what he heard.
The judge was doing his summing up whether to let the Lizzie James evidence to be allowed as evidence, and it was all like legal jargon and stuff like that, so obviously I wasn't listening at all. And I was just doodling in a book, and the next thing I knew, the judge stood up and walked out. And I thought, oh, is it over with now? Can I go back to the prison? Because I remember that we had a nice meal that night. You know, did a stir fry, and it was really nice. And I looked down towards my barrister, Jim Sturman, and he had a big grin on his face. And he stood up, shook my hand, and he said, you're free. You know, you can go home now.
The judge threw out the case and delivered a scathing attack on the police. But although Colin was now a free man, his name had become associated with the case, and it would be many years before Rachel's killer was named.
Difficult question I'm going to ask you, Colin. Why didn't you change your name?
I'm proud of my name. Why should I? It would be dishonourable to my ancestors, especially to my father.
I have that kind of huge kind of admiration for you to sit here and say, I don't play the victim, I don't blame anybody, the police were just trying to do the job. That's life. There's people in the world out there much worse than I am. I'm okay.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fine. I'm just looking ahead towards the future now.
That's more than pretty impressive, Colin, more than pretty impressive.
Napper may have been behind bars for the murder of Samantha and Jasmine, but it would take 16 years before forensic science would finally convict him of the murder of Rachel Nickell. I'm keen to find Roy Green, one of the forensic team, who finally made the breakthrough that had eluded the police for so long. Hi, Roy, it's Jackie Malton here. I know of your work as a forensic scientist on the Rachel Nickell murder, one of Robert Napper's victims. I hope you can provide me with more information.
Hi, Jackie. Yes, the Rachel Nickell case was one of mine. Why don't we meet up and I can discuss the approach we took to identify Napper as the offender?
He was attacking women with children in broad daylight in parks. And for me, that was so much of a coincidence to say, well, hang on, that's what's happened here. But I said to the senior investigating officer that we really ought to consider him as a, you know, with some care. But he said, well, that's fine, but where's the evidence?
DNA swabs had been taken from Samantha's body at the time of her death. With advances in DNA techniques, Roy believed there may be a chance of achieving a match between Napper and Rachel's death.
Following a series of tests on the same material and on the tapings that they had originated from, we managed to develop a profile. When you've got it in front of you and you're looking through your list of 30 and go, yeah, this matches, that matches, and you go right the way through all of the components you've got and they all match, then you look across to see who it matches, and it matched Napper. That was quite a moment.
Was that the only piece of forensic evidence you discovered in your re-examination?
In addition to the DNA that we found, there were some shoe marks, footwear marks that were at the scene of the attack on a muddy bridle path on Wimbledon Common. And these footwear marks were across the path as if whoever had made them was not walking along the path but had been crossing it. And below there was a stream where there was a sighting thought to be Robert Napper at the time. And the mark made by the heel had some fine detail in it, and that matched the same heel pattern that Napper had on his shoes.
What was the third piece of evidence?
One of the items that we looked at was Alex Hanscom's head hair combings.
That's the son of Rachel Nickell.
Yeah. Now, he'd been found clinging to his mother, and so we looked at the debris from his hair combings, and in there were red paint flake mounted. In amongst Robert Napper's belongings that had been seized when he went to Broadmoor, there was this red toolbox, and that was of interest to him. He kept saying, where's my toolbox? And he used to keep his knives in there. And so what we did was we compared the paint fragment to the toolbox, and the paints matched.
Reinvestigating this case has clearly demonstrated to me just how devious and dangerous Napper was, but also how diligent and determined the police proved to be in putting this deadly man behind bars, where he'll remain for the rest of his life. But this crime is something that never leaves the detectives who worked on it. Amongst them, Alan Jackman, who was the family liaison officer. He forged a lifelong friendship with Samantha Bissett's family, one that continues to this day. I've travelled to Scotland with Alan to meet Samantha's stepfather, Jack. The last time Alan was here was to attend Samantha's funeral, and Napper was still at large. Did you take that video?
Yes, I took that, yes, She looked after us so well. So she did. That was her life as her daughter. She loved her daughter to bits.
Oh, look at that. The little girl looking out to sea.
It breaks your heart to see Jasmine walking along there and Samantha enjoying every moment of life and loving her little girl.
You know, smiling, they're happy. Not much time later, they both lose their lives. It's just... You just can't imagine, can you, that a man like Robert Napper...
Destroying families.
Destroying families, Jack.
Destroying families, right. Definitely destroying families. And they used to come up here and stay with us, stayed in the flat here. Used to go along the beach happy as anything with Jasmine there and things like that, you know. So it was really very... It was a close-knit family, just a very good family to me.
What did she tell you and her mum about living in Plumstead?
She quite liked staying there, actually. Everybody got on so well together, it wasn't real.
How would you like Samantha and Jasmine to be remembered?
Well, the way I remember them is just about such a... Both of them were just absolutely fantastic. I just remember both of them running about, playing down by the beach and running along the waterside and things like that, you know. It was really nice to see them. Just a nice, nice girl.
And do you know what has come out of this, which is so apparent, is that Samantha was doing her very best as a single mum to provide a life and opportunities for her daughter, Jasmine,
yes,
and she was focused on this child.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And on the video it shows you that. That was all she was interested in, was in Jasmine. Rightly so, you know, she just loved that wee girl to bits, you know. So good, that was her life, that was it.
This is your flower! My flower? Yeah!
But her life was cut too short for them all. And that was all down to Napper.
All down to Robert Napper?
All down to Robert Napper. Destroyed a lot of lives.
He did? He did. Thank you, Jack. It's a real privilege to meet you.
And thank you very much indeed. You've all been so kind. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. All the best.
Meeting Jack and seeing those home movies is a reminder of how Samantha and Jasmine were and remain very much loved. And their memory really does live on. But for me, the question remains, why did Napper commit these awful crimes? I'm hoping forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone can help me unlock the answer.
He is currently thought to be suffering from paranoid schizophrenia.
What is paranoid schizophrenia?
Where people have the view that other people, quite irrationally, they hold these views, are out to get them. And that's where I think we can look to the childhood of Robert Napper, who was brought up in a violent, domestically violent background, and his mother had to give up him and his siblings for foster care. And it is argued that that was a sea change in his development at a critical time in his development, 10, 12, that sort of era, and could well be mixed in with the paranoid schizophrenia, which was later diagnosed. It also can come hand in hand with delusions of grandeur. So he's said by his psychiatrist to have claims of having a maths degree. He's supposed to believe he got the Nobel Peace Prize for fighting in Angola, etc., etc. Well, when you've got that level of detachment from reality, together with hostility and anger against the outside world, facilitated by a psychotic condition, well, it's not surprising, is it, that such grotesque crimes can be committed spontaneously and extraordinarily violently. Both those crimes that we've discussed, Miss Bissett and Miss Nickell, were done in the presence of young children. And the door has to be kept widely open that isn't something to do in the background of a mother-son relationship or a mother-child relationship, and that there isn't some sort of festering issues or complex relating to his childhood relationship with his own mother.
I know that the police felt at the time that that was a strategy on his part, that he would target women with young children because he believed that the woman would become compliant in order to protect her child.
Yes.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's absolutely valid and a current, a relevant theory and understanding of the case. However, he could have got submission from those women with the use of a gun or knife or anything. So I wouldn't want to rule out that there wasn't an additional agenda of doing this to mum with the presence of a child. So I think it could be a double-edged thing, that it served a useful purpose in terms of forensic cleverness, but at the same time served a purpose of having some sort of exorcism of a demon in regard of his mother and him.
Few cases have moved me as much as this, and by returning to Plumstead Common on a quiet summer's evening, it's hard to believe that this peaceful place was the scene of such a devastating murder. In this particular case, it was absolutely horrific and vile. Every detective has spoken about the horrific scene that they were faced with, that they thought that they were coming to a domestic murder. That's bad enough in itself. Invariably, it's women attacked by the husband or partner. And that's what they thought that they were coming to. When they went to the scene, this was obviously not a domestic murder. It was somebody who was sadistic, frenzied, psychopathic, horrendous injuries caused to Samantha, horrendous injuries sadly caused to a young girl who had not yet begun to live her life. Jasmine Bissett would have been 30 years old. 30 years old, a young woman in London, and she had a life taken away by a monster, aged 3.